The wagon sat in the middle of Caldwell's Main Street like a wounded animal, its left rear wheel cracked clean through the hub, one axle bent at an ugly angle, and the canvas cover torn down the middle where a windstorm had grabbed it 2 nights past. And every man who walked past it in the yellow Kansas morning light of 1882 looked at it, the way people look at things they have already decided are beyond saving. Ida Cooper stood beside it with her chin lifted and her jaw set hard, which was the only way she knew how to stand when everything around her was falling apart, and everything around her had been falling apart for the better part of 6 months now. She was 24 years old, brown-haired and sunburned at the cheeks, with hands that were rougher than they used to be and eyes that were still sharp and dark, and full of something people who didn't know her might mistake for anger, but was really just the particular kind of focus that comes from surviving a long string of bad luck without the luxury of crumbling. Her father, Thomas Cooper, had died in March from a lung sickness that the doctor in Wichita said had been coming for years, which Ida found both true and useless as a piece of information. He had left her the wagon, a decent mare named Biscuit, $62 in a tin box beneath the floorboards, and a small parcel of land outside of Caldwell that needed fencing and a proper well before it would be worth anything at all. He had not left her a brother or a husband or any kind of partner who might help her haul lumber and drive posts into the ground, because Thomas Cooper had been the kind of man who believed in doing everything himself until the day he couldn't do anything at all. Ida had been trying to sell the wagon for 3 days. She needed the money to pay a man named Harlan Potts, who owned the livery stable where Biscuit had been boarded while Ida stayed at the Caldwell boarding house and sorted through the paperwork of her father's estate. Harlan Potts was not a cruel man, but he was a precise one, and he had made it very clear that his patience did not extend indefinitely, and that he expected $7 for 2 weeks of boarding by Friday, which was tomorrow. The wagon had been whole when she'd arrived in Caldwell, or mostly whole, which is a different thing. The rear wheel had been weakening for miles, though she hadn't known it, and when she'd pulled into town, it had finally let go with a sound like a rifle shot, which had startled Biscuit and caused a man on the boardwalk to spill his coffee, and had marked Ida Cooper's arrival in Caldwell with the particular kind of embarrassment that clings to a person for days. She had gone to 3 different buyers. The first was a man named Garrett who dealt in wagons and tack on the south end of town, and he had walked around the wagon twice, kicked the broken wheel with his boot, looked at the bent axle, and said $12, which was an insult so low that Ida had felt her face go hot just hearing it. A wagon of that make and size, even needing repair, was worth 3 times that. The second buyer, a homesteader named Dell who was looking to replace his own rotting wagon, had offered $15, and then retracted the offer entirely when he looked underneath and saw the axle damage. The third was the blacksmith, a thick-armed man named Rourke, who told her flatly that he had no use for it and that she'd be better off selling it for parts, which would bring her perhaps $8 or $9 total if she was lucky and patient, neither of which she currently felt. She had come back to stand beside the wagon this morning because she didn't know what else to do, and because standing beside a problem sometimes felt more useful than sitting in a boarding house room worrying about it, even when standing beside it changed nothing at all. That was when Isaac Wallace came down the street. She noticed him the way you notice someone who moves differently than the people around them, not louder or faster, but somehow more deliberate, like each step was being chosen instead of just happening. He was tall, maybe an inch or 2 over 6 feet, with dark hair pushed back under a wide-brimmed hat the color of old wood, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that was not exactly handsome in the conventional way, but was striking in the way that landscapes can be striking, all angles and contrast, and something lived in. He wore the plain working clothes of a rancher, canvas trousers, and a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he walked with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was going even when he didn't. He was 29 years old, though Ida didn't know that yet. He slowed when he saw the wagon. His eyes moved over it in the professional, assessing way of someone who had worked with wagons and animals and the kind of machinery that breaks down in inconvenient places. And then his gaze moved to Ida, and there was nothing impolite in it, just a clear and honest attention that she found slightly disconcerting after 3 days of men looking past her to the wagon and then looking away from both of them. He stopped. "You selling this?" he asked. His voice was low and unhurried, with the particular flatness of someone who had grown up in Kansas or maybe Missouri and had never bothered to dress his words up. "Trying to," Ida said. She kept her voice even because she was very tired of men hearing desperation in it and using it as a number. "Wheels cracked and the axles bent. Anyone who's looked at it has told me as much themselves before I had to." "I can see that," Isaac said. He walked around the wagon the same way the others had, but slower, and he crouched down near the axle and looked at it from underneath for a long moment. When he stood back up, there was a small crease of concentration between his brows that smoothed out almost immediately. "What are you asking?" Ida had practiced the number several times in her boarding house room. She had started at 50 and talked herself down to 45, and then back up to 48 before deciding that 45 was honest and 48 was wishful thinking. $45, she said. Isaac Wallace looked at the wagon. He looked at it for a long moment, and Ida braced herself for the argument, for the counteroffer, for the long process of being worn down by someone who had all the time in the world and she had none. "All right," he said. Ida stared at him. He had already reached into the inner pocket of his shirt and was counting out bills with the calm efficiency of a man settling a routine transaction, and Ida stood very still because she could not quite make her mouth form words for a moment. "All right," she finally said. "Yes, ma'am." He held out the money. $45 exactly. She took it because she was practical above almost all other things, but she did not stop looking at him, and after a moment she said, "Why?" Isaac Wallace looked at her. There was something in his expression that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, like he had been expecting the question, but hadn't finished working out the answer. "It needs work," Ida said, because she was not the kind of woman who let things lie when they deserved to be examined. "The wheels cracked through the hub, not just the rim. The axle's going to need a blacksmith and probably a full day's labor. You'll spend $20 putting it right before you can use it, maybe more. 3 men before you walked away from it. So why?" He looked at her for a moment, and she watched something move behind his eyes, a kind of searching, like he was rummaging through his own reasons and finding them not as neat or as organized as he would have liked. "I don't have a clean answer for that," he said finally. And the strange thing, the thing that Ida Cooper would turn over in her mind in the days that followed, was that she believed him entirely. There was no performance in it, no false modesty. He had said the truest thing available to him and offered it without decoration, and she found it more honest than anything anyone had said to her in weeks. She folded the money and put it into her coat pocket. "Ida Cooper," she said, and extended her hand. He shook it with the same directness he did everything else. "Isaac Wallace." "Thank you, Mr. Wallace," she said. "Isaac," he said. She looked at him for another moment. This man who had bought her broken wagon at full price without a clean reason and without apology. And then she nodded once and walked back up the street, toward the livery stable to pay Harlan Potts his $7 and figure out what to do next. She thought about him 3 times before she reached the stable door, which she noted with some irritation as an unusual number. The livery stable smelled of hay and horses, and the particular warm animal closeness that Ida had always found more comforting than she was entirely willing to admit. Harlan Potts was exactly where she expected him to be, sitting on an overturned crate near the far stall with a ledger on his knee, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who has been quietly calculating whether he was going to have a problem and is cautiously relieved to see that he isn't. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, and then corrected himself immediately, because she had told him twice that she was not married, Miss Cooper. I was beginning to wonder. $7, Ida said, and counted it out from the money Isaac Wallace had given her, which still felt slightly unreal in her hand. As agreed. Harlan tucked it into his ledger without making a fuss of it, which she appreciated. "Biscuit's been good," he said. "Fine mare. You heading out soon?" "Tomorrow morning," Ida said, because she had made that decision somewhere between the wagon and the stable door without quite realizing it. She had the land. She had the mare. She had $38 remaining, which was enough for supplies and seed if she was careful, and the spring was still young enough that she had time to get something in the ground if she moved quickly. What she didn't have was a wagon. She stood there for a moment in the warm-smelling stable air and thought about that. The boarding house was a low, narrow building on the east side of the main street, run by a woman named Mrs. Fenn, who was somewhere between 50 and ancient, and who had the gift of knowing when to leave people alone, which Ida had come to appreciate deeply. She served a plain supper each evening, and that night there were 4 other boarders at the table, 2 traveling merchants going south, a cattleman who ate quickly and said nothing, and a young woman named Clara who was waiting for her, intended to arrive by stage, and vibrated with a nervous excitement that Ida found both endearing and exhausting. "You look like you're thinking hard about something," Clara said to Ida across the beans and cornbread. "I sold my wagon today," Ida said. "That's good, isn't it?" "It's complicated," Ida said, and Clara nodded as though she understood, which she probably didn't, but the gesture was kind. After supper, Ida sat on the small wooden chair in her room and counted her money again and made a list on the back of an envelope, because lists were the thing that kept her from feeling like the ground was moving under her. She wrote: supplies, seed corn, fence posts, wire, tool for well digging, food enough for 6 weeks. She added the numbers twice and came up with $31 and change required, which left her $7 for everything else, which was tight but not impossible. What was impossible was hauling any of it without a wagon. She could hire a teamster to take the supplies out, which would cost money she didn't have to spare. She could make multiple trips on horseback, which would take weeks she didn't have if she wanted to get the planting done before June. Or she could find another wagon, which brought her back around to the problem she just solved in the wrong direction by selling the only one she had. She went asleep thinking about it and woke up thinking about it, and she was standing in front of the general store on the main street at 7 in the morning with her list in hand when she heard someone say her name. "Miss Cooper." She turned, and it was Isaac Wallace, leading a horse from the direction of the livery stable, a big gray gelding with a calm, steady expression. He had the look of a man who had been up for hours, which was probably true given that ranchers started their days before the town woke up. "Mr. Wallace," she said, and then remembered and corrected it. "Isaac." "I was hoping to find you," he said, and then looked briefly like he wasn't sure how to proceed from there, which she found interesting given how straightforward he had seemed the day before. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me if it's out of line." "Go ahead," she said. "I heard from Harlan at the stable that you've got a parcel of land out on the Cooper Creek Road that belonged to your father, and that you're trying to work it." He paused. "I ride that road. My ranch is about 3 miles past your property line, and I'm making a supply run to the store this morning and again in 2 days." Ida waited because she could see where this was going and she wanted to see how he was going to say it. "I could carry your supplies out," he said. "No charge. It's on my way and I've got the wagon space." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was still low and golden, and it caught the angles of his face in a way that made him look, for just a moment, like something out of a painting, but she pushed that thought aside because it was not useful. "Why?" she said. It was the same question she'd asked before, she realized, and she saw a faint shift in his expression that might have been amusement. "Same answer as yesterday," he said. "I don't have a perfectly clean one." "You keep not having clean answers," she observed. "I keep doing things that don't have them," he agreed. She thought about it for 3 seconds, which was longer than she needed to, but which felt like the appropriate time to demonstrate that she was not desperate enough to accept help without thinking about it. Then she said, "All right. That would be useful. Thank you." He nodded, as if a deal had been settled, and said, "I'm heading into the store now if you want to make your list." They went into the general store together, which she noticed garnered exactly 2 glances from the proprietor, a short man named Aldous who had the mustache of a man trying to look more important than he felt. Isaac bought his own supplies, which were numerous and practical, and Ida bought hers, and when Aldous began to calculate what it would cost to transport her order out to the Cooper Creek property, Isaac said quietly that it would be going with his, and Aldous recalculated without comment. They walked out together into the street, and Isaac began loading the back of a sturdy flatbed wagon that was parked alongside the store, and Ida helped because standing while someone else carried things was not in her nature. "You've been out here long?" she asked, not because she was making conversation for its own sake, but because she was genuinely curious about the kind of man who paid full price for broken things and offered freight service to strangers without clean reasons. 6 years, Isaac said. He hoisted a sack of feed with the easy economy of someone who has done it 10,000 times. Came out from Missouri. Bought 40 acres that I've since added to, got cattle and horses, and a couple of hands who work with me. "You have people working for you, too," he said. "Brothers Emmett and Lou Briggs, good men, and no family of your own." She said it without quite meaning to, or rather, she meant to say it, but she hadn't decided to say it before it came out, and she heard the slight impropriety in it immediately and felt the back of her neck warm. Isaac straightened from the wagon and looked at her with an expression that was entirely without offense. "No," he said simply. "Not anymore." The word "anymore" carried something in it that she didn't push on because she understood the weight of that kind of word, having used it herself in several contexts lately. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "It was a while ago." They finished loading the wagon, and he drove it out of town with Ida riding alongside on Biscuit, and the morning opened up around them into the wide Kansas grassland that she had grown up looking at, and had always found both beautiful and slightly terrifying in its enormous indifference. Her father's land was 30 acres, flat and good for the most part, but badly neglected in the 2 years since Thomas Cooper's health had made it impossible for him to work it properly. The house was a small 2-room structure that her father had built 20 years ago, and that had weathered well enough but needed work on the roof, and had a broken window in the east room. The fence line along the northern side had collapsed in 3 places. There was a well that was not dry but was shallow and unreliable. Isaac helped her unload the supplies without being asked, which she both appreciated and found slightly complicated because she was not accustomed to help that didn't come with an accounting. When they were done, he stood in the doorway of the small house and looked around it with the same assessing look he'd given the wagon, and then he said, "Roof's not bad. The south corner needs attention before the next rain." "I know," she said. "You have a ladder." "Not yet," he nodded. "I have a spare one out at my place. I can bring it when I come back through." She looked at him. She was beginning to notice that his offers of help arrived in this same quiet, practical way, without ceremony or expectation, as if they were simply logical extensions of whatever situation he found himself in. It was very different from the kind of help that announced itself and required gratitude in proportion to its cost. "Isaac," she said. "Yes. Why are you doing all of this?" He was quiet for a moment, leaning against the doorframe with the easy posture of a man comfortable in spaces, and the midday light came in behind him and turned the edges of his hat gold. "Because you're out here alone with a lot of work to do," he said, "and because nobody should have to do everything alone." It was the most complete answer he had given her, and it was still not entirely clean, because there were 100 women alone with work to do in Kansas in 1882, and he was not offering to haul their supplies, and they both knew that. But it was honest, and she had decided already that she preferred his honest, incomplete answers to the polished, complete ones that men usually offered. "I'll take the latter," she said. He came back 3 days later with the latter, and with the two Briggs brothers, Emmett and Lou, who were perhaps 22 and 20 respectively, broad-shouldered and cheerful and startlingly well-mannered, and who fixed the south corner of her roof in 2 hours while Isaac rebraced the collapsed sections of her fence line, and Ida herself began turning the soil in the kitchen garden with a determination that she was aware probably looked somewhat ferocious from the outside. They all ate lunch together sitting on the ground outside the house, which was not a thing Ida had planned but which happened naturally when there were 4 people and work to be done and noon arrived, and she made cornbread on the iron stove, and there was dried beef, and the first coffee she had made in her own house since she'd arrived, and it tasted better than the coffee at Mrs. Fenn's boarding house, though she thought that might partly be the circumstance. Emmett Briggs had a habit of talking at length about subjects he knew something about, which included weather patterns, the best way to treat a horse's hoof, and the particular cruelty of the Kansas wind in March. And Lou Briggs said almost nothing but laughed easily at his brother's digressions, and Isaac sat with his coffee and listened with the comfortable expression of a man who has heard this particular talker many times and does not find him tiresome. After they had eaten and the brothers had gone back to the fence work, Isaac stayed and helped Ida string the wire along the newly braced posts, and they worked side by side in the afternoon sun with a comfortable quiet that surprised her, because she was not a person who found silence with new people comfortable as a rule. "You going to plant corn?" he asked at one point. "Corn and some wheat," she said. "Maybe some kitchen things, squash, beans, whatever I can get in before it gets too hot. You'll want to run the plow before you broadcast the seed. Ground's been fallow a couple years, it'll be tough." "I know how to plow," she said, and there was no sharpness in it, just information. He looked at her sideways, and there was something in the look that was not patronizing at all, was in fact almost the opposite, a kind of quiet recognition. "I know you do," he said. She didn't ask why he knew that. She thought maybe it was the same way she knew things about him, from the way he moved and worked and spoke, from the particular competence that a person carries in their hands and their posture when they have been doing a thing for a long time. They finished the fence line on the east side before sundown, and Emmett and Lou loaded up and rode back toward the Wallace ranch, and Isaac stayed a few minutes longer, standing near the fence they had finished and looking out across her land in the long golden light that turned the grass into something almost molten. "It's good land," he said. "I know," she said. "My father knew it too. He just ran out of time." There was a pause, and he said, "How long ago?" "March," she said. 2 months past." He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Ida." It was the first time he had used her first name, and she noticed it without deciding to and felt something shift very slightly in the air between them, not dramatically or uncomfortably, just a small calibration, like a door moving on its hinge. "Thank you," she said. He rode out a few minutes later, and she stood at the fence and watched him go until the dust of his horse's hooves settled back into the grass. And then she went inside and cooked a plain supper, and ate it at the small table with her father's kerosene lamp turned up high, and felt, for the first time since Thomas Cooper had died in the bedroom of the Wichita house with the sound of March wind outside, something that was not quite happiness but was the neighboring territory to it. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the best of what Ida could remember, in the way that things often are when the hardness and the goodness come from the same source. She plowed from dawn until her arms shook, and she planted in the plowed rows with a careful precision that her father had taught her when she was 9 years old, walking the furrows with a bag of seed corn at her hip, and her hands dropping it at intervals she measured by the length of her stride. The well gave her trouble. It had always been shallow, and by the 3rd week of May it was pulling up water that was cloudy and slow, not bad water exactly but insufficient water, and she knew she needed to go deeper, which was work that required either a second person or equipment she didn't have. She had not seen Isaac in 10 days when she walked out to check the well on a Tuesday morning, and found him and Lou Briggs riding in from the east with a set of well-digging tools strapped to the back of Lou's horse, a wood and metal contraption of drill bits and pipe that she recognized as the kind of thing you hired out for a significant sum. She stood by the fence with her arms crossed and watched them come and felt a complicated knot of gratitude and something else that she couldn't name exactly and that she was not quite ready to examine. "I didn't ask for this," she said when they reached her. "No," Isaac agreed, stepping down from the gray gelding. "Lou's been wanting to try this equipment anyway. Good practice." Lou looked at her with an expression of complete guileless cheerfulness. "It's true, Miss Cooper. I've been looking for somewhere to use it." "That is the most conveniently timed practice I've ever heard of," she said. Isaac looked at her steadily and said nothing, which she was learning was a thing he did when he thought the truth was already present in the room and didn't need his help. They dug the well deeper that day, all three of them taking turns with the drill and the heavy work of hauling out the earth. And by late afternoon they had hit a good seam of clean water that ran clear and cold and steady. And Ida filled a tin cup from it and drank, and it tasted like something worth the whole long day of work. And when she looked up, Isaac was watching her with a quiet expression that she looked at for a moment longer than she intended before she looked away. At supper that evening, which had become the natural conclusion to any day that Isaac and his brothers came to help, Lou was in fine form explaining at length a story about a horse that had escaped its paddock and been found 3 miles away standing in the middle of a wheat field eating contentedly. And Emmett, who had joined them after finishing his work on the Wallace ranch, kept interjecting corrections to the story that Lou absorbed without irritation. And the small house was full of voices and the smell of coffee and the low light of the lamp, and Ida thought, privately, that it was the first time the house had felt like something inhabited by the living since her father had left it. After Lou and Emmett had ridden home, Isaac stayed to help wash the dishes, which was a small domestic intimacy that struck her as slightly startling but which he seemed to consider entirely natural. They stood at the basin side by side, and she washed and he dried, and the night wind came through the open window and moved the lamp flame gently. "They're good men," she said, meaning the brothers. "The best I've worked with," he said. "They came out from Ohio 3 years ago, orphaned young, made their way west. Emmett's got a girl in town he's too afraid to ask a question to." "What question?" "The important one," Isaac said. Ida smiled at that, and she heard the smile in her own voice when she said, "He should just ask her." "I've told him approximately that," Isaac said. "He's working up to it." She handed him the last tin cup and he dried it and set it on the shelf, and they stood for a moment in the companionable aftermath of shared work, and the night was very quiet around the house and the lamp threw a warm circle of light that ended at the edge of the dark. "Isaac," she said. "Yes. I want to pay you back. For the well work, for all of it." He turned to look at her, and there was a slight frown between his brows, not a displeased frown but a thinking one. "That's not necessary," he said. "It is to me," she said. "I'm not in the business of owing people. You don't owe me anything." "Then tell me why you keep coming," she said. "And this time I want a cleaner answer than you've been giving me." He was quiet for a moment that stretched out long enough to be something more than just gathering words. The lamp flame leaned slightly in the window wind and came back upright. "Because I want to," he said finally. "Because I find excuses to come out this way, and that's not a coincidence, and I think you know that." Ida looked at him for a long moment. Her heart was doing something steady and deliberate that she was aware of in an unusual way, like she had become conscious of her own breathing. "I know that," she said, and her voice was very even. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was careful and honest in equal measure, a kind of openness that was not vulnerability exactly but was adjacent to it, the way a man looks when he has said something true and is waiting to see what the truth costs him. "I should tell you," he said, "that I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean. I don't have much gift for it. So when I say I find reasons to come out this direction, I want you to understand that I mean it simply and not as flattery." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then something in his expression settled, not resolved exactly, but quieted, the way a field looks after a wind has moved through it. "All right," he said, which was the same thing he had said when he bought the broken wagon, and she found that she understood it in both contexts as a kind of acceptance, an agreement to let the situation be what it was. He left shortly after, and she stood at the window and watched him ride out into the dark and thought about honesty, and the particular courage required to offer it without knowing how it will be received. June came in like a door opening, warm and full of light, and Ida's corn was up in rows that she walked every morning with a feeling she didn't trust herself to call pride, but that was something very close to it. The wheat was coming in well, too, and she had 3 rows of kitchen vegetables in a state of enthusiastic growth, and the new depth of the well was holding steady and clean. She rode into Caldwell twice in June, once for supplies and once because Mrs. Fenn had sent word that there was a letter for her, which turned out to be from a cousin in Illinois who had heard about Thomas Cooper and wanted to know if Ida was all right. She was, she wrote back, which was the truest short answer to a question that deserved a longer one. Isaac came to her place 7 times in June, which she knew because she was aware of it, and because she was honest with herself about the things she was aware of. He came for reasons that were always practical. He brought a bag of nails she had mentioned needing. He checked the fence on the west side where a post had gone soft at the base. He rode out one afternoon simply because he was passing, which was a fiction they both maintained comfortably, because it was the container in which the truth traveled. And the truth was that he wanted to see her, and she was glad to see him. And both of those things were becoming harder to keep inside the plain boundaries of neighborliness. On a Thursday afternoon in late June, there was a thunderstorm that rolled in from the northwest with the seriousness of purpose that Kansas storms carry, and Ida was in the field when it came, and she ran for the house but was still 50 yards out when the rain came down in a curtain, and she arrived at the door soaked to the bone and laughing because sometimes rain is simply funny when you are already entirely wet, and there is nothing else to be done about it. Isaac was on her porch. He had been riding past, this time perhaps genuinely, on his way back from town, and had seen the storm coming and pulled up rather than ride through it, and he was sitting on the step under the narrow overhang with his hat dripping and his expression that of a man who has witnessed something that pleased him and is trying to be dignified about it. She was still laughing when she reached the porch, wet through and entirely undignified, and she pushed the door open and said, "Come inside before you drown sitting up." He came inside, and she put water on for coffee and changed her wet shirt for a dry one in the back room, and came out to find him standing near the window, watching the rain come down with a quiet attention she had come to recognize as one of his most characteristic postures, this particular way he had of being fully present with whatever was in front of him. She made the coffee and they sat at the table and listened to the rain on the roof, which was now the good sound of rain on a repaired roof, and the afternoon light filtered gray and cool through the window, and it was not the first time they had sat together in her kitchen, but it felt, in some way she couldn't entirely account for, different from the other times, quieter and more particular, as though the rain had pulled a curtain around the house and left them in a space of their own. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "The day you bought the wagon," she said. "When you said you didn't have a clean answer, what was the unclean one?" He looked at her across the table and the rain came down outside and he turned his coffee cup slowly between his large, careful hands. "You looked like someone who needed it to be worth something," he said, "and nobody was giving it that. And I thought that was wrong, not the price, the principle of it, that a thing should be worth what it's worth." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a very clean answer," she said. "I told you I had it somewhere," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was technically a smile, but was so quiet that it was almost more than a smile, something beyond simple expression. "And was there anything else?" she asked. She kept her voice careful, and even because she did not want to lead him toward an answer, she wanted to find out if the answer was already there. He looked at her directly. "You want me to say that I stopped because of you and not just the wagon," he said. "I want you to say what's true," she said. "Yes," he said. "I stopped because of you." The rain kept coming down. Ida looked at him across the table and felt something in her chest that was not any of the complicated feelings she'd been carrying for months, not the grief or the exhaustion or the worry, but something simple and fundamental, like a note struck on a string. "I stopped," she said carefully, "because of you too, the first day. When you said you didn't have a clean answer, I thought there is an honest person and I don't meet so many of those. I know I'm not the easiest company," he said. "I don't talk much. I'm out here with the ranch most of the time. I'm not a man with a lot of elegant things to offer." "I don't need elegant things," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't think you did." They sat with that for a moment, which was a new kind of sitting together. Not the comfortable quiet of two people working alongside each other, but something more charged and gentle at the same time, like the feeling before a rain when the air changes and you know what's coming. "Isaac," she said. "Yes." "I think you should probably come back on Sunday," she said. "Not because the fence needs work or the well needs checking or anything else that needs doing." He looked at her, and the quiet smile that was almost more than a smile came back. "I'll come on Sunday," he said. The storm moved east over the next hour, and when it had gone the world outside was washed clean and greener than it had been, and he rode out in the cleared evening air and she stood on the porch and watched him go, and this time she was smiling. He came on Sunday, and it was the first time he came with no pretense of work, and they walked the property together in the late morning, which was something she had wanted to show someone and hadn't had someone to show. And she told him about the land the way her father had told her, which was with a kind of quiet reverence for its particulars. This corner where the creek bent and ran clear even in dry years. This ridge where you could see all the way to the next homestead if you stood at the right angle. This small grove of cottonwoods at the west edge that her father had always called the Sunday trees, because they were the best place to sit on a Sunday afternoon. They sat under the Sunday trees, and the grass was still damp from the week's rain, and the cottonwood leaves turned and caught the light, and the sound of the creek was just audible, low and steady, and they talked in the unhurried way of two people who have decided to let time serve them rather than the other way around. He told her about Missouri, about the farm where he had grown up, about his mother who had died when he was 15 and his father who had sold the farm 2 years later and gone west and died on the road from cholera before he ever got where he was going. And Isaac had been in Kansas already by then, 17 and working other men's cattle. And he had heard about his father in a letter from a neighbor back home, and had felt something he couldn't name for a long time, and had finally understood as a kind of grief that was also a kind of relief, because his father had been a hard man, and the relationship between them had been the complicated kind. Ida told him about growing up on this land, about her mother who had died of fever when Ida was 11, and who she still sometimes dreamed about, clear and vivid as a visit, about her father who was a good man and a quiet man, and who had taught her to work and to think and to be suspicious of anyone who didn't say what they meant, which had made her both capable and occasionally difficult to know. "He sounds like someone I would have liked," Isaac said. "He would have liked you," Ida said, and felt the truth of it even as she said it, which was a strange and not unpleasant feeling, the thought of the two of them together in the same world. "I'm sorry I didn't get the chance," Isaac said, and it was the simplest thing and also the most precisely right thing he could have said, and she felt it settle somewhere in her chest beside all the other things she'd been keeping there. They stayed under the cottonwoods longer than they intended to, the way you do when you are somewhere that has earned its name, and when they finally walked back to the house, it was early afternoon, and she made a meal and they ate together at the table with the windows open and the warm summer air moving through, and afterward he helped her with the dishes again, which had become their particular domestic ritual. And she thought that it was possible to fall in love with the small, consistent things a person does as much as with any grand gesture, maybe more so. He kissed her for the first time on the porch that evening when he was leaving, a deliberate and careful kiss that asked a question and waited for the answer, and her answer was unambiguous. And when he pulled back and looked at her, his expression was the most unguarded she had seen it, something young and hopeful and slightly astonished in it, and she thought it was likely the same expression she was wearing. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she agreed. July was the month they became themselves in relation to each other, which is to say that the thing between them stopped being a question and became a fact, or perhaps a practice, something they engaged in daily, the way you engage in the practices that sustain a life. He came on Sundays as established, and more often than that as the days required, and she rode over to the Wallace Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, because she had been curious about it, and curiosity had always been one of the things she trusted most in herself. The Wallace Ranch was a serious and working place, 40 acres of well-maintained fencing with a solid barn, and a house that was plain but well-built, and 2 corrals where a dozen horses moved in the summer heat with the easy grace of animals that have been treated well. Emmett and Lou Briggs were there, working leather in the shade of the barn, and they greeted her with the uncomplicated warmth of men who were glad to see someone that their employer was glad to see. The house was clean in the way of a bachelor's house, functional and without the particular touches that signal someone has decided to be comfortable rather than just housed. And she did not say anything about this, but she noticed it in the way you notice things about people. Isaac showed her the horses, which were his pride in the way that her corn was hers, and she recognized in the way he talked about them the particular love that a person has for a living thing they have raised and cared for over time, and she asked questions that made it clear she knew horses, which pleased him in the way that competence always pleased him in a person. In the corral there was a young mare, barely 2 years old, with a coat the color of copper in the light, and a disposition that seemed to be either very brave or very foolish, or possibly both in the way that young things sometimes are. "What's her name?" Ida asked. "Doesn't have one yet," Isaac said. "She hasn't told me what it is." Ida looked at him, and he was completely serious about this, which she found both charming and slightly eccentric. "Horses tell you their names, if you wait long enough," he said. She looked at the copper mare, who was looking back at her with large, calm eyes that held an expression of complete self-possession, and said, "Patience." "There it is," Isaac said. They had supper at the Wallace Ranch that evening with Emmett and Lou, and Emmett was in a state of obvious distraction that she understood immediately was related to the girl in town who had not yet been asked the important question, and she and Isaac exchanged a small look over the table that was the kind of look that belongs to 2 people who have been paying attention to the same things. After supper, she and Isaac walked out along the east fence line in the long July evening, and the sky was the particular deep blue of a summer sky that has decided to take its time going dark, and the stars came in from the east first and then spread west, and they walked slowly and talked about the things people talk about when they have stopped being careful with each other. His plans for the ranch, her plans for the land, the things they wanted that they had not yet named in the company of other people. "I want to add on to the house," she said. "Not right away, but the back room is small, and if there were ever more people in it, there wouldn't be space." He looked at her, and she could feel him deciding how to respond to what was both a practical statement and something else, and she was glad for the way he took things seriously without making them heavy. "I can help with that," he said, "when you're ready." "I know you can," she said. The night was warm, and the grass smelled of the last heat of the day lifting out of it, and there were crickets in the cottonwood grove somewhere to the south, and she thought that this was a thing worth protecting. This particular evening in this particular place with this particular man, and that she was going to say so, because honesty had been the beginning of this whole thing, and she saw no reason to stop. "Isaac," she said. "Yes. I'm very glad you bought the wagon," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him smiling in the half-dark, which was a better smile than the daytime ones because it didn't have to be careful about itself. "So am I," he said. She stopped walking, and he stopped with her, and she put her hand on his arm, and he turned and looked at her in the soft blue dark of the Kansas July evening, and she said, "I think I love you," in the same voice she used for important true things, which was a steady and clear voice, and she watched something come into his face that was the most complete and uncomplicated happiness she had seen in a person. "I know I love you," he said, and his voice was low and rough at the edges, and he said it with the same simplicity he used for everything, which made it the most credible thing she had ever heard. He kissed her there in the grass with the stars coming in from the east and the crickets doing their work in the distance, and she put both hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was quick and real and very present, and she thought of how long the road had been to this particular moment, her father's death and the long spring and the broken wagon in the middle of the Caldwell Street, and how strange and precise the path of things was, that it should lead here, and that she should be grateful for every difficult step of it. August brought the harvest, which was the most physical work Ida had ever done, and she said so while doing it, which she allowed herself because there was no one to hear it except Biscuit, who was pulling the small hand reaper and who had no opinion on the subject. The corn came in well, better than she had dared to hope, and the wheat was decent if not spectacular, and the kitchen garden had produced a quantity of squash that she found slightly overwhelming, and that she had begun distributing to anyone who came within range of the property. Isaac came every day during the harvest week, and Emmett and Lou came too, and the four of them worked in the fields from first light until the light was gone, and in the evenings they ate together on the porch because the house was too hot, and the food was simple but there was a lot of it and the company was good, and Ida found herself looking at the four of them around the makeshift porch table and feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the August heat. On the last day of the harvest, when the last of the wheat was in and the corn was stacked, and the yard smelled of cut grain in the best way that a yard can smell, Emmett Briggs went into Caldwell and finally asked the girl in town, whose name turned out to be Nora Clement, the important question, and came back with an expression of such stunned and radiant happiness that Lou burst out laughing and Isaac shook his hand for a long time and Ida hugged him, which made him turn red in a way she found enormously endearing. She said yes, Emmett said, still in the slightly dazed state of a man who has taken a leap and found ground instead of air beneath him. "I heard you were working up to it," Ida said. 3 months, he said. "I don't know what took me so long." "Fear," Lou said helpfully. "Thank you, Lou," Emmett said without heat. That evening after the brothers had gone, Ida and Isaac sat on the porch steps in the cooling dark, and the harvest smell was still in the air and somewhere west a coyote was commenting on the evening, and she leaned against his shoulder and felt the solidity of him, which was a physical comfort she had not known she was waiting for until it was there. "What was it?" she said. "That stopped him for 3 months. He was afraid she'd say no," Isaac said, "but she didn't." "No," Isaac said, "she didn't." Was quiet for a moment. "Is that a thing you understand?" she asked. Being afraid of the answer, he put his arm around her and she felt the shift in the way he was sitting, the particular gathering of a person who is about to say something true. "It was," he said, "until I figured out that the asking was what mattered, that you don't get to know the answer without asking." She turned to look at him. The porch lamp was low and his face was half in shadow and entirely attentive. "Is there a question?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment with that searching, careful expression she had come to know as the face he wore when he was choosing words that needed to be exactly right. "Will you marry me, Ida?" he said. "Not because you need help on the land, and not because I can offer you the most comfortable life in the territory, but because I want to be the person in your life who is always on the porch when the storm comes in, and I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my days in your company." She looked at him, and the coyote called again in the west, and the night was warm and full of cricket sound, and she felt the full weight of the question and the full rightness of the answer. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Isaac." He kissed her, and she thought again about the broken wagon in the middle of the Caldwell Street and the man who had stopped without a clean reason. And she thought that there was no clean reason for love either, that it arrived the way he had, with a purpose that preceded its own explanation, and you either recognized it or you didn't. She had recognized it. They were married in October, at the small church in Caldwell that smelled of wood polish and autumn cold, in front of a congregation that included Mrs. Fenn from the boarding house, who cried in a dignified way, Harlan Potts and his wife, who had apparently been following the progression of events with interest, Emmett Briggs and his betrothed Nora, who held hands throughout the ceremony, and who Ida thought looked like a couple in a painting, Lou Briggs, who was the best man, and who made the shortest and most genuinely heartfelt toast she had ever heard at a wedding, and a scattering of neighboring homesteaders and townspeople who came because the autumn was mild, and it was a good reason to gather. The church was decorated with the dried corn husks and seed heads from the harvest, which Mrs. Fenn had organized without being asked, and Ida wore her good blue dress that she had not worn since her father's funeral, but that had been her mother's dress once, altered and preserved, and she thought her mother would have been glad of this particular occasion. Isaac wore his good clothes, which meant a dark coat and clean trousers, and his boots polished to a degree that suggested the assistance of Lou Briggs, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle with the same full, unhurried attention he gave everything he cared about. And when she reached him, his expression was the open and astonished happiness she had seen on the porch that July evening. And she thought it was a fine expression on a man, and that she would like to see it regularly for the rest of her life. The minister was a plain man who said plain things in the plain way of someone who understood that the words themselves were the occasion and didn't require embellishment. And when he asked if anyone had a reason why these two should not be joined, he paused the appropriate length and nobody said anything. And when he asked Isaac if he would take Ida to be his wife, Isaac said, "I will," with a quiet certainty that she felt in her whole body. And when he asked Ida the same, she said it the same way. They said their vows in the clear October light coming through the church windows, and she held his hands while she said them, which were large and work-rough and entirely familiar, and she felt that this was a good and true thing, this particular joining, and that her father and her mother would have recognized it as such. There was a celebration after in the town hall that lasted into the evening, with food that the neighboring women had brought, and a fiddle player named Henderson who was old but accurate, and Emmett danced with Nora with a joyful incompetence that made everyone who watched them smile, and Isaac danced with Ida in the way of a man who is not natural to dancing, but is willing to be good at it for someone he loves, which she found more moving than Grace would have been. They drove out to the Cooper land that night, which was now the Wallace land too, or rather they had agreed it would be a Cooper Wallace land because her name belonged to it, and she was not willing to let it disappear. And Isaac had agreed without hesitation because he was a man who understood what names meant to things and people. The house was small and familiar and hers, and he stepped through the door with her as her husband in the soft lamplight, and she thought that a house changes when it is entered as a home by choice rather than necessity, that it lifts slightly, settles more deeply into its own foundations at the same time. "There are only 2 rooms," she said, "and one is barely the size of a proper thought." "We'll add on in the spring," he said. "You promised that once before." "I always keep my promises," he said, which was, she had learned, the truest thing he could have said about himself. They were happy that winter with the particular happiness of people who have found the right situation after enough of the wrong ones, a happiness that is not without its daily difficulties and small frictions, because happiness of that kind would not be credible, but that has a solid floor underneath it, so that the difficulties and frictions are just weather and not earthquakes. Isaac moved his work between the Wallace Ranch and the Cooper Wallace land, leaving Emmett and Lou to manage the cattle operation under his general direction, while he put his energy into the land that would be their primary home and livelihood. This worked because Emmett, now engaged and looking at a future of his own with Nora, was ready for more responsibility and met it with a seriousness that made Isaac genuinely proud. The winter was cold in the way that Kansas winters are cold, which is to say thoroughly and without apology, and Ida and Isaac found in those cold months the particular domesticity of two people who have genuinely chosen each other, the small rhythms of shared meals and shared labor and shared sleep, and the conversations that happen naturally in the evenings when the wind is outside, and you are inside, and there is lamplight, and someone you trust entirely in the same room. He told her more about Missouri in those evenings, about the hard years and the good ones, about the way he had come to Kansas with nothing but the intention to make something. And she told him more about her mother, about the particular quality of grief that has no dramatic event to contain it, just a long, slow learning to live without a presence that had been fundamental. They read to each other sometimes, from the small collection of books on the shelf that had been Thomas Cooper's, a Bible and a farmer's almanac, and a novel that had come from somewhere and whose author neither of them could identify, and a collection of poems that had been her mother's, which Ida read from in a low voice while Isaac sat with his feet near the stove and his eyes closed, not sleeping, but listening with the full attention he brought to everything. She asked him once, in one of those evenings, what he thought about the things that were happening in the territory, the way the land was changing, the way the homesteaders were crowding into spaces that had belonged to people before them, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said that he thought it was a thing that would be accounted for in history in ways that were not comfortable, that the taking of land was a fact and facts didn't disappear because people found them inconvenient to look at. She respected that answer and told him so, and they talked about it seriously, as she felt it deserved, because the grassland around them was not empty of its own past even when it looked that way from a certain kind of eye. By February she knew she was pregnant. She told Isaac on a Tuesday morning, straightforwardly, over breakfast, because she had never been the kind of person who made theater of important things, and she watched his face move through surprise, and then something fierce and bright that was not quite like anything else she had seen in him, a kind of joy that was also a kind of terror in the best way. He put his hand over hers on the table and said nothing for a moment, just held her hand and looked at her with that complete attention, and then he said, "We'll need to build out that back room before September." She laughed, because it was exactly what he would say, and because it was the perfect expression of love in a practical man, that the first thing he thought of was making space. "We will," she agreed. Spring came back in March with its usual optimism, the grass going green overnight, and the cottonwoods putting out their first leaves in the grove that was now officially called the Sunday Trees by anyone who knew the property. And Emmett and Lou and Isaac began work on the addition to the house, a new back room and a larger kitchen, which was accomplished in a series of Saturdays spread across March and April, with the help of a neighbor named Gil Haskell, who was handy with wood, and who came in exchange for Isaac's help fencing Gil's south pasture the following month. Nora Clement came out to help Ida several times during the construction, and Ida found her to be a woman of sharp intelligence and genuine warmth who had been waiting for someone to ask her serious questions. And they became friends in the way that two women become friends when they recognize in each other a certain quality of noticing things and not keeping quiet about them. "Emmett says Isaac never talked to anybody before you," Nora said one afternoon while they were planning where Ida's garden should expand in the second year. "He talks," Ida said. "Not the way he does now," Nora said. "Emmett says the difference is visible. That Isaac used to be like a man who had his shutters mostly closed." Ida thought about that. "I think he needed somewhere to be," she said. "Not physically, but somewhere that was his in a way the ranch wasn't entirely." "Don't we all?" Nora said, and looked at the house where the sounds of hammering were audible, and there was a quiet satisfaction in her expression. Emmett and Nora married in June of that year, a smaller wedding than Isaac and Ida's but no less joyful, and Lou stood up for his brother again, and made another short perfect toast that Emmett later said was the thing he was most grateful for aside from the bride herself, which Nora took with the good humor of a woman who knew exactly what she had. The baby came in the late summer, at the end of August, in the new back room that had been built precisely for this purpose, with a midwife named Mrs. Garland from Caldwell who was brisk and competent, and who talked throughout the process in a low, steady voice that Ida found genuinely helpful. Isaac was in the house the whole time, which Mrs. Garland allowed without comment, and when the baby came and made its first declaration known to the world, Ida heard Isaac in the other room make a sound she had never heard from him, something low and undone and full. The baby was a boy, which surprised her slightly because she had been so certain, and she held him in the late afternoon light of the August room and looked at his face, which was red and new and entirely its own self, and felt the particular love that is immediate and permanent and has no question in it. Isaac came into the room and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms and watched his face, which was the most open she had ever seen it, all the careful steadiness gone and nothing underneath it but a pure and naked love that she thought would stay in her memory until the last day of her life. "Thomas," she said. He looked at her. "Thomas," he said, and she could hear her father's name in his voice, and it was right. "Thomas Isaac Wallace," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's a good name." "I know," she said. Thomas Isaac Wallace grew through the fall and winter into a baby of strong opinions and considerable volume, who slept in the new room, and made the house feel occupied in a new and permanent way. And Ida found that motherhood had some of the same quality as farming, in that it required patience and attention, and the willingness to respond to what was actually there, rather than what you had expected. Isaac was a father with the same quality he brought to everything he loved, steady and attentive and deeply genuine, and she watched him with Thomas and felt a happiness that was compounded and layered and had depth to it, like good soil. Lou Briggs, for his part, became Thomas's unofficial second uncle with a devotion that surprised everyone including Lou, who had not previously known he had this in him. He came out to the Cooper Wallace property most Sundays and spent considerable time making faces at the baby, which Thomas received with the serious, evaluating expression of an infant who has not yet decided whether faces are funny or not. The second winter of their marriage was the winter that confirmed to Ida that she had made no mistake and needed no confirmation, which is perhaps the best kind of confirmation there is. It was a hard winter, colder than the first, with a stretch in January that kept them mostly in the house for 10 days, and 10 days in a small house with a winter and an infant and a husband is the kind of test that either proves a thing or breaks it. And what it proved, unambiguously, was that she and Isaac were the right people for the life they had built. They argued twice during those 10 days, once about the best way to preserve the grain supply, which was a legitimate disagreement that they resolved with practical good sense, and once about something so small she couldn't remember it afterward, which resolved itself by the end of the afternoon with the same ease, and she thought that arguing with Isaac was different from the argument itself, because he never let the argument become about anything except what it was actually about. And when it was done, it was done. By the second spring she had added to the garden, expanded the kitchen, established a small egg operation with a dozen hens in a new coop that Isaac and Lou built in a single day of cheerful efficiency, and had started to think seriously about the school question, because Thomas would not be a baby forever, and there was no school within reasonable distance of the Cooper Wallace land. She mentioned this to Nora, who had been thinking about the same thing with the same concern, because Emmett and Nora were expecting their first child by fall. "We could push for a school district," Nora said. Mrs. Garland was saying there are enough children in this part of the county now. If the families petition the county board, that would take years, Ida said. Everything takes years, Nora said reasonably. That's why you start. Ida talked to Isaac about it that evening, and he said that she was right, and that she should lead it because she was better at talking to people than he was, and because it was her idea, which was the correct and practical thing to say. And she wrote 3 letters that week, to the county board and to the minister in Caldwell who knew most of the families in the district, and to a woman named Hester Proctor who had been a teacher in Ohio and had come west with her husband and was, according to common knowledge, bored and underutilized. Hester Proctor wrote back in a week. The county board took longer. The minister helped. It took a year and a half, which was faster than Nora had predicted and slower than Ida had hoped. But the Caldwell Creek School District was established in the fall of 1885, with a small schoolhouse built on a donated half-acre between the Proctor and the Haskell properties, and Hester Proctor as its first teacher at a salary that was not as much as she deserved but was a beginning. Thomas was 3.5 by then, too young for school but the right age to understand that a building was being made for children, which he found extremely interesting. Emmett and Nora's son, a boy named James who had been born the previous fall, and who was already demonstrating the Briggs gift for enthusiastic commentary, would be among the school's first proper students when the time came. Isaac rode out to see the schoolhouse when the frame went up, and stood beside it with that assessing look she knew well, and she stood beside him, and they looked at the frame of a building that would hold the future in a particular way, and she thought about Thomas Cooper, her father, who had believed in education with the particular fervor of a man who had not had enough of it himself, and thought he would have liked this. He would have helped build it, she said. Your father? Yes. I know, Isaac said, and put his arm around her, and they stood there in the early autumn light with the smell of new lumber around them, and the grass beginning to color toward its fall gold. The years settled into them, and they into the years with the comfortable permanence of 2 things that have found their natural fit. The Cooper Wallace property grew. A 3rd room added to the house when Ida was pregnant with their 2nd child, another expansion of the fence line, a 2nd horse for working the fields alongside Biscuit, who was aging but steady and whose dignity was absolute. Their 2nd child arrived in the spring of 1886, another boy they named Henry, which was Isaac's father's name, offered without the complicated feelings that name had once carried and received with something that might have been healing. Henry was a different creature from Thomas, quieter and more watchful, with Isaac's particular quality of attention from almost the beginning, and the 2 brothers together were a pair that Ida found both exasperating and entirely dear. Patience, the copper mare, had grown into exactly the horse she had promised to be, strong and composed, and with a temperament that was, Isaac said, the best of any horse he had ever worked with. He entered her in the county fair in the fall of 1886, and she won 2 categories, and would have won a 3rd if the judge hadn't been a man with a grudge against the Wallace Ranch that everyone knew about and nobody talked about directly. Isaac accepted the partial result with equanimity and brought Patience home, and gave her an extra measure of grain, and told her she had done well. And Ida watched him do this through the barn window and thought, not for the first time, that a man who was good to his animals was a man who was good at the core, and that she had known this about Isaac before she had words for it. Lou Briggs, who had been living in the bunkhouse at the Wallace Ranch for 4 years now, finally met a woman of his own at the county fair that fall, a red-haired woman named Clara who was selling preserves at her family's table, and who turned out to be, on closer acquaintance, someone with a sense of humor exactly calibrated to match Lou's own. They were engaged by Christmas, which moved even faster than Emmett and Nora had, and Isaac said at the announcement supper that he had been expecting it for years, and Lou said he had no idea what Isaac meant, and everyone at the table laughed. The Christmas of 1886 was the Christmas that Ida looked back on in later years as the one that held everything, the full shape of the life they had built, because it gathered together all the people who mattered in the way that only certain gatherings do, when the company and the occasion are equal to each other. The supper was at the Cooper Wallace house, which was now large enough to hold everyone, and there were Isaac and Ida and Thomas and Henry, and Emmett and Nora with James and their new baby girl Martha, and Lou Briggs and Clara and Mrs. Fenn from the boarding house, who had become a kind of grandmother to the community by virtue of her seniority and warmth, and Gil Haskell and his wife from the neighboring property, and Hester Proctor, who came on her own because her husband had gone back east 2 years ago and not returned, which she had processed with a composure that Ida respected enormously. The house smelled of pine and roasting meat, and the particular warm yeast smell of bread that Ida had made that morning, and Thomas ran between the adult's legs with the absolute confidence of a child who has never been anywhere that wasn't full of people who loved him, and Henry sat in Isaac's arms and watched the room with that serious watching quality that was entirely his own. After supper, when the table had been cleared and the children were beginning to lose altitude, Isaac stood up and said he had something to say, which was unusual enough that the room went quiet with a kind of fond attention. He was not a man who made speeches. He stood at the end of the table with Henry against his shoulder and looked around the room at everyone in it, and he said, "I want to say that this is what I was working toward when I didn't have words for it, all those years. I didn't know what it looked like, but I knew it was something like this." He looked at Ida. "And I know that it started with a broken wagon on a street in Caldwell, which is about as unlikely as most true things are." There was laughter around the table, and Mrs. Fenn made a noise that was either a laugh or a suppressed cry, and might have been both, and Emmett raised his glass and said, "To the wagon," with complete seriousness, and everyone raised their glasses, including Lou and Clara, and Ida raised hers and looked at Isaac across the table and the lamplight and the company, and felt the full gathered weight of everything that had come from that morning in Caldwell with the wagon, the man who stopped without a clean reason, the question she had asked him, the answer he had given. "To the wagon," she said. The spring of 1887 brought a third pregnancy, which Ida acknowledged with the combination of joy and pragmatism that was her particular signature, and with some relief that the house addition was already done. Thomas was 5 and Henry was barely a year, and the idea of a third child in the busy household made her feel both full and slightly mathematical. "We're going to need a second horse for the children," she told Isaac, "not about the baby but about the logic of the future." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it." "Of course you have," she said. He smiled, and it was the real smile now. Not the small, careful one from the early days, but a wide and unguarded smile that she had come to consider one of her particular possessions, something she had helped bring out of a man who had kept it in reserve for a long time. The baby was a girl, born in October with black hair like her grandmother had had in the one photograph Ida had of her mother, and they named her Ellen after Ida's mother. And Thomas met his sister with a solemnity that made every adult in the room want to cry. And Henry touched her hand with one small finger, and then looked at Isaac with an expression that seemed to ask for an explanation of what exactly this new development was. The Cooper Wallace land was fully fenced by the end of 1887. The well was reliable and deep. The grain production was steady and improving, and the 3 hens had become 15. Which was more eggs than any family could reasonably consume, and which had turned into a small additional income at the Caldwell market that Ida managed with the same precise care she gave everything. She taught Thomas to read that winter, using the collection of books from her father's shelf, and a patient method that had no official name, but that consisted primarily of loving the books herself in a way that made him want to know what was in them. He was a quick child with a good memory and the particular gift of sitting still for things that interested him. And by spring, he could read simple sentences and had opinions about the almanac's predictions for the coming season. Hester Proctor would take him at the school in the fall, which was both an ending and a beginning, and Ida spent some time in the evenings of that winter simply being present with him in the lamplight while he learned, knowing that this particular season of his beginning was limited, and that the school year would open him outward in ways that were good and right, and that she would miss anyway. She mentioned this to Isaac one evening after Thomas was asleep, this particular sadness of watching a child become more their own person. "Is that a sad thing?" he asked. "No," she said. "And yes," he nodded. "I think about my parents sometimes," he said. "The way they didn't get to see what came after all of this." He looked at the room around them, the lamp and the shelves and the door to the children's room. "I think they would have been surprised, my father especially. He didn't think I'd amount to much." "He was wrong," she said flatly. "He was," Isaac agreed. "I don't think he could have imagined this." "What do you imagine?" she asked. "When you look ahead." He thought about it in his particular way, the long, quiet pause that was not blankness but the opposite of it, a fullness. "More of this," he said. "Thomas at school and coming home with all the things he learned and telling us about them at supper. Henry and Ellen growing, the land coming in better every year. You," he looked at her. "Always specifically you." She looked at him across the lamplight. This man she had known for 5 years now, and knew better than she had known anything. The way he moved and thought and loved and kept his word. The way he made space for things and people without drawing attention to the making. The way he had stopped on a street in Caldwell in front of a broken wagon without a clean reason, and that absence of reason had turned out to be the most important reason of her life. "I thought you weren't a man with elegant things to offer," she said, which was what he had told her when he had asked her to marry him. "I'm not," he said. "I meant all of that." "I know," she said. "That was the elegant part." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held it, and the lamp burned low, and the children slept in their room, and the Kansas night was quiet outside and full of stars, and everything that had been broken was whole, and everything that had been uncertain was settled, and the wagon that had started it all was long since repaired and working on a neighboring homestead, carrying its new owner's life from one place to another in the reliable way of things that have been given what they were worth. Which was everything. Thomas started school in the fall of 1888 and came home on the first day with a reverence for Hester Proctor that was total and slightly competitive, as though he suspected she might have other favorite students and was preemptively establishing his claim. He told them at supper about everything he had learned, geography and the names of rivers and how to do long addition, and Henry listened with his head tilted and his serious eyes, and Ellen sat in Isaac's lap and reached for the butter dish repeatedly with the determination of a child who believes persistence is always rewarded. The school had 12 students that first year, including James Briggs and 4 children from homesteads to the north, and Hester Proctor taught them with the energy of a woman who has found the right use for herself after a long time, and the schoolhouse that had taken a year and a half to make real became the thing that made the community, a center of gravity that drew people together around the fact of their children's futures. The county was changing, too, with more homesteaders coming in and the cattle trails beginning to fade as the railroad brought new ways of moving things, and Isaac had begun to shift the Wallace Ranch operation toward horses specifically, breeding and training rather than pure cattle ranching, because he had an eye for horses that Emmett had been telling him to trust professionally for years. Patience's offspring were already developing a reputation at the county fair, and by the end of 1888, he had 3 buyers in the territory who came to him first when they needed working horses of quality. Ida's hens had become a small and actual enterprise, supplying eggs to 2 stores in Caldwell and to Mrs. Finn's boarding house, which was a satisfaction she had not anticipated, and that she found, once she had it, very congruent with who she was, the building of useful things in a careful and expanding way. On a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1889, She and Isaac walked out to the Sunday cottonwood grove together, as they sometimes still did, when the children were busy, and the ranch was quiet, and the day offered itself as a gift. And they sat under the trees in the way they had the first summer, and the creek ran low and clear, and the cottonwood leaves turned in the light with the same uncaring beauty they always had. Thomas was 6 1/2 and at school. Henry was 3, and had Isaac's quality of silence in the mornings, and his own quality of brightness in the afternoons. Ellen was walking with tremendous confidence and climbing things she should not climb, and had Isaac's father's black eyes in Ida's mother's face, which was a combination that seemed to have been specifically designed to make Isaac helpless in the face of whatever she asked for. "I was thinking," Ida said, looking up through the cottonwood branches at the blue Kansas sky. "You're always thinking," Isaac said. "I was thinking about the wagon." "Again." "Still," she said, "I think about it as the pivot. The point where the story turned. Because of me buying it," he said. "Because of me asking why," she said. "If I hadn't asked, we might have just exchanged a thank you and gone our separate ways." He considered this. "Maybe," he said, "or I'd have found another excuse." "What would the excuse have been?" "I don't know," he said, "but I would have found one." She smiled and leaned back against the trunk of the cottonwood and closed her eyes and felt the sun on her face, and the cool of the tree's shadow alternating as the leaves moved, and the creek sound, and the very specific and irreplaceable weight of someone you love sitting beside you in a quiet afternoon. "I'm glad you didn't have a clean answer," she said. "So am I," he said. The afternoon opened out around them, generous and unhurried, and the Sunday trees did what they had always done, which was simply be there, reliable and deep-rooted in the Kansas earth, making shade without ceremony or request, the way the best things do. She thought about her father, Thomas Cooper, who had loved this land and left it to her, along with a broken spring and a long road, and the unexpected gift of a man who stopped on a Caldwell street and did something generous for a reason he couldn't explain, which turned out to be one of the best and truest things that ever happened to her. And she thought that her father would have called that grace, which was what he called the things that couldn't be accounted for by effort alone. She thought he was right. The evening came in slowly over the Kansas grass, the long gold light of a prairie spring turning the whole world amber and patient, and they walked back to the house together in the cooling air, and the children's voices came out through the open window, Thomas explaining something to Henry with the pedagogical authority of a 6-year-old who has recently acquired information, and Ellen's laughter bright and brief as a bird call. And the smell of supper that Nora had started when she'd come over to visit and had apparently decided to simply make, because Nora was that kind of person. Isaac opened the door and Thomas ran to him immediately with something crucial to report about what he had learned in school that week, and Henry followed at a more dignified pace, and Ellen made a sound from across the room that was her particular summons, and Isaac crouched down and gathered all three of them with the ease of a man for whom this was the most natural thing in the world, which it had become. And Ida stood in the doorway of the house that had been her father's, and was now hers and Isaac's and their children's, and looked at the life assembled in its lamplight, and felt the full measure of it, all of it, from the broken wheel cracked through the hub to this warm and occupied evening, all the hard seasons and the good ones, all the true things said in plain voices, all the honest answers and the honest absences of answer, and she thought that nothing in the world was more worth counting than this, exactly this, the specific and irreplaceable life you find when you stop in front of the broken thing and pay it what it's worth. She stepped inside. She closed the door on the prairie dark. The lamp burned warm and steady, and outside the Kansas night spread itself vast and full of stars over the Cooper Wallace land, over the Sunday trees and the deep-dug well, and the rows of spring planting pushing green through good earth, over the fence lines that held and the roof that kept the rain out and the horses in the paddock standing quiet in the dark. And it was all exactly what it was, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was everything.